And welcome everybody to our second day of witnesses regarding the Uyghur situation in China. We have today from the department, from the Ministère des Affaires étrangères, du Commerce et du Développement, Evelyn Puxley, directrice Direction de la Chine.
The Director Greater China Political and Coordination.
The end of this meeting to discuss an issue around witnesses.
Okay. Okay, so we will go for 50 minutes, 5-0, and then we will end at 5-2, and we'll go in camera for just a few minutes. So if you would like to start with your opening remarks, Ms. Puxley.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you, members of the committee. We're very pleased to have this invitation to come before you. And I do have some opening remarks, and then I'd be very happy to answer any questions you may have, and to provide more information if I don't have the answers to hand today. So if I may begin with my opening statement. I want to emphasize at the beginning that the relationship between Canada and China is a priority for the Government of Canada. It's a very multifaceted relationship, but defense of human rights and international norms in that regard is very central to that relationship. We do continue to seek a comprehensive relationship with China built on trust and mutual benefit, in which common interests and respective concerns can be addressed. As part of this relationship, as I mentioned, Canada is committed to constructive exchanges with China on human rights. This is a core component of our bilateral engagement. That having been said, I think it's fair to say we are deeply troubled by credible reports regarding arbitrary mass detention, prolonged and without due process of Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities in Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. We understand that in detention, Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities face patriotic education with reports of mistreatment. Such actions by Chinese authorities would appear to challenge the cultural, linguistic, and ethno-religious traditions of Uyghurs and other Muslims under, and here I'm quoting UN reports, under the pretext of countering extremism and terrorism, unquote. These actions are contrary to China's constitution, its international human rights commitments. They are also contrary to the UN strategy to counter global terrorism, a strategy which was agreed to by consensus of the UN General Assembly in 2006. Access to Xinjiang is difficult due to security measures and controls on free movement there, especially for diplomatic personnel. This having been said, the Embassy of Canada in China has been closely following developments in Xinjiang and the situation for Uyghurs elsewhere in China. In a moment, I'll mention some of the most recently publicly available information on these topics. I'd like to flag that some of what Canadian diplomats have seen in Xinjiang corroborates these external and independent reports. In August, the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination released its concluding observations related to China. It raised alarm with the situation in Xinjiang. This has helped to bring more information to the forefront, and I think I should say that a lot of the information we've had has really been developed only in the last 6 or 7 months, and the CERD report was certainly important in that regard. The UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination regretted the lack of official data on how many people are in long-term detention in Xinjiang or who have been forced to spend varying periods in political, quote, re-education camps for even, and I quote again the UN Committee, for even non-threatening expressions of Muslim ethno-religious culture, such as greetings. The committee noted that estimates have put the number of people detained to tens of thousands to over 1 million. But as I say, the disparity in the numbers reflects the fact that there aren't really hard data on who has been detained or imprisoned. We understand that the Chinese government have built facilities and are building facilities to accommodate the large number of detainees in Xinjiang, and that surveillance activities in the area have intensified. The UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, otherwise known as CERD, noted reports of mass surveillance disproportionately targeting ethnic Uyghurs, such as frequent police stops, scanning of mobile phones at police checkpoint stations, Other reports have been received of the mandatory collection of extensive biometric data of large groups in Xinjiang, including DNA samples and iris scans. The UN committee heard reports that all Xinjiang residents are required to hand over their travel documents to police and to apply for permission to leave the country. That permission may not come for many, many years, and this restriction, we understand, particularly affects those who wish to travel for religious purposes, for example, to go on Hajj. Chinese authorities haven't provided official data related to the detentions. For this reason, the UN CERD has asked authorities to provide information related to the detainees, for example, grounds for their detention, the number of persons held against their will in the past 5 years, as well as any measures taken to ensure that their families are promptly notified of their detention. The CERD's observation also referred to reports that many Uyghurs who had left China have allegedly been returned to the country against their will, and there are fears for the current safety of those returned to China against their will. We note that the governments of Germany and Sweden have both recently halted deportations of Uyghurs back to Xinjiang, back to China, based on many of these same concerns. I'd also like to refer to the opening statement made at the Human Rights Council in Geneva last month. The new UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, formerly leader in Chile, indicated that CERD's concluding observations corroborated other reports that the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights had received. In light of these reports, they requested that the government of China permit access for the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights to all regions of China. Additionally, in September, Human Rights Watch released an extensive report based on interviews of 58 former residents of Xinjiang. Individuals reported that half or more of their immediate family members are in a mix of political education camps, pretrial detention, and prison. According to Human Rights Watch, there have been reports of deaths in the camps, raising concerns about physical and psychological abuse, as well as stress from poor conditions, overcrowding, and just the nature of indefinite confinement, in other words, no fixed term. We understand that basic medical care is available, but Human Rights Watch had also heard that people are held even when they have serious illnesses or are elderly, that there are also children in their teens, pregnant and breastfeeding women, and people with disabilities. Former detainees reported suicide attempts and harsh punishment for disobedience in these facilities. We know that political indoctrination and re-education are not new in China. They have affected Tibetan Buddhists, Uyghur Muslims in the past, Christians, Falun Gong practitioners. I think it's important to emphasize that it is the size and apparent intent and reports of what has been happening in Xinjiang that are raising concerns in the international community. We are aware that the situation seems to have been deteriorating over the past few years. We have heard of family members of Canadian citizens with Chinese citizenship who have disappeared or are in detention and can no longer be reached, and that their travel documents have been seized by Chinese authorities. It's in light of this situation that earlier this summer, in July, we updated the travel advisory to China. It now indicates that Chinese authorities are increasingly detaining ethnic minorities in the region without due process. It also indicates that family members of Canadian citizens with Chinese citizenship have been detained. Some of our like-minded partners have also recently updated their travel advisories in a similar vein. Xinjiang has been increasingly difficult to access for foreigners. We are aware of only a very few and a rapidly dwindling number of foreigners living in Xinjiang today. In terms of Canadian actions to date, we have raised the situation in Xinjiang directly with Chinese authorities on numerous occasions and at numerous levels. Most recently, in September, Deputy Minister of Global Affairs Canada, Ian Shugart, raised this issue with his Chinese counterpart, Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, Zheng. This was during regularly scheduled annual bilateral consultations with the Foreign Ministry Deputy. Minister Freeland, as you may have seen in the press, subsequently raised Xinjiang with her counterpart, Foreign Minister Wang Yi, in a bilateral meeting on the margins of UNGA in New York in September. And previously in UN and multilateral fora in March 2018, we raised our concerns regarding the treatment of Uyghurs as well as Tibetans at the UN Human Rights Council. making a statement under, I think it was item 1. We urged authorities to immediately release all individuals detained for exercising their human rights, including their right to freedom of religion, freedom of belief and expression, and to protect advocates for linguistic and cultural rights. Also in July, Canada signed on to a statement of concern on China with respect to the situation in Xinjiang at a ministerial meeting on religious freedom that had been hosted by the U.S. State Department in Washington. This statement raised the situation in Xinjiang at considerable length. Yes, I'm coming to the end. We've also raised our concerns in this September at the Human Rights Council. We will continue to call on China to uphold its international human rights obligations. The next opportunity is the Universal Periodic Review of China on November 6th in Geneva. And with that, Madam Chair, I think I will conclude my remarks. I welcome, as I said, questions and comments from yourself and through you from other members of the committee. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, and perfect timing, so thank you for that. And we'll start with 7 minutes of questions from Mr. Sweet.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Puxley, for your testimony. I hope that you don't expect a lot from the Human Rights Council. I just, if you follow my Twitter, you know that I just put out some information in regards to the cast of characters that are on there, and I don't think there's very many that really respect human rights, at least as how we would describe them anyway. The EU on the 2nd of this month put out very strong statement in regards to, a very strong resolution in regards to the situation of Uyghurs and Kazakhs in China. You had alluded to the fact, and they mentioned specifically in their resolution the actions taken by Germany and Sweden in regards to suspension of any return of Uyghurs or Kazakhs or Turkic Muslims to China. What is Canada's position in that regard?
Well, as I mentioned, we're aware that some like-minded countries, Germany and Sweden, have taken this measure. In some cases, it's a temporary measure. I think what I can say in that regard is we are in very close touch with the Canadian authorities that decide on such issues, namely IRCC, the Immigration, Refugee and Citizenship Canada. I have trouble remembering the new acronym, as well as CBSA that is involved in deportations. And our engagement is essentially to make sure that they have the latest information, the latest credible information that we have, both from Canadian sources and other independent sources. I think the question as to exactly where we stand at the moment is probably best put to the IRCC and CBSA, but it's certainly an issue that is very much top of mind for us. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, one of the challenges we've faced is that a lot of the information has come to us only relatively recently. So the third report was issued in August. We felt enough concern to have taken the issue to the Human Rights Council in April and again signed on to the statement in Washington in July. But actually getting evidence as opposed to rumor and hearsay has been extremely challenging. And obviously we want to advise our ministers and the Government of Canada based on the best available information that we have. But yes, deportations of Uyghurs who are in Canada back to China, whether it's to Xinjiang or anywhere else, is certainly something that we are very much focused on in consultation with the relevant departments and agencies.
I would hope soon we'll make a strong statement like Germany and Sweden and make it clear that we have no intention of doing that. China, you mentioned about evidence, but the People's Republic of China, of course, are masters at making sure that they suppress any capability of gaining evidence. You mentioned about the difficulty of getting in. This has been a pattern with the People's Republic of China for, from Tibet to the Falun Gong, as you mentioned, Christians, and now today with Uyghurs. I'm concerned with the arbitrary detention, but I'm even more concerned about the reports and very clear reports in regards to organ harvesting. This is what's happened with the Falun Gong. Now we hear it's happening with Uyghurs. And I received some information just recently that at the Kashgar airport, there's actually a special lane for people who are arriving there for organ harvesting, for organ transplants. And so I'm wondering if you're aware of that and what kind of actions that you've taken in that regard to informing the Chinese officials.
Thank you. I'm actually not aware of that, and I'd welcome your sharing that information with us. I think what I can say in general on organ harvesting, we know this has been a huge concern, including in Canada. I think the information available to us suggests that there is less now than there had been, but however, it is still a practice that continues. But as I said, I'm not aware of that particular report, and I would welcome your sharing that with the department, and we will certainly look into it. So thank you for bringing it to our attention.
Yeah, thank you. I would hope that the department actually follows our witness evidence very closely, because I think we've already had one witness. I think you'll hear from many of them in that regard. And I actually would suggest to you that the organ harvesting market in the People's Republic of China has actually expanded, not diminished. And again, we've heard evidence in that regard by two distinguished Canadians, David Kilgour and David Matus, who have continually monitored the situation. And certainly that's the case for the Falun Gong. I would think that it would be the case that would continue with the Uyghurs as well. I'll just give the last part of my time to my colleague, David Anderson.
Okay, well, perhaps we'll be able to come back to this. I just wanted to ask you Canada's opinion on the government in the region apparently now have basically officially legalized, apparently illegally, but officially legalized the re-education camps that are in place. This just happened in the last couple of days. I'm just wondering, does that change the government's perspective on those camps? What's the Canadian government going to do in order to address that issue? I've got some other questions, but I'll leave that one with you right now. The camps have been made legal. How does that affect the Canadian government's approach to them?
Madam Chair, maybe I could say I think there's concerns about a variety of different camps, some for re-education, some for vocational training, some that are more clearly detention camps, and some that have been described as camps to essentially turn people away from their religion and away from what is described as violent extremism. So I think we have to be very careful about which type of camps we're talking about.
Can I just mention, they include most of what you just said, which I think their Article 33 says, it talks about institutions such as vocational skill education training centers should carry out trainings on common national language, laws and regulations, and vocational skills, and carry out anti-extremist ideological education and psychological and behavioral correction to promote thought transformation of trainees and help them return to society and family. So that sounds like a pretty complete list of basically trying to destroy people's culture and their religious beliefs.
To leave it there. So there will be another round, so you can revisit that topic. Before we go to the next question, I would just also like to acknowledge that we have, many of us have shadows today from the University of Toronto Women in the House. They're sitting in the back, and just like to acknowledge their presence and welcome them all to Parliament. So thank you for being here. And now we will move on to Mr. Tabera for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the witness for being here. I just want to talk a little bit about the court system in China and whether it's effective or not. According to Section 5, Article 123 of the Constitution, the people's courts are the judicial organs of the state. So generally, if we look at Western states, we have a checks and balances system like the United States and here in Canada, and we have the executive, the legislature, and judicial branches. Thank you. And so these are a checks and balances system to ensure that not one branch has more power than the others. So would you, in your expertise, would you say that these courts are not as effective as protecting these minority groups as we have here in the West?
Perhaps I could answer it by saying one of our concerns is that the mass detentions actually, to date, that we're aware of, haven't, with the exception of this recent change to the law, haven't been as a result of any due process whatsoever. So rule of law doesn't really enter into it. And we're looking very closely at the recent change that was made to the law that may govern some of the camps, but not others. I think in terms of the judicial system in China, what I would say is this is an area where Canada and China have a long history of cooperation, exchanges. They understand our system better. We seek to understand their system better. I think it's fair to say, however, that the Chinese judicial process is very different, as you underlined, from Canada's, particularly with regard to the independence of the judiciary and checks and balances. And I think it varies depending on whether the issue at hand is protection of human rights or commercial disputes. But I think that's a question where, frankly, I would be happy to give you more information on our assessment of a judicial system which is indeed very different from Canada's, but in which there has been some development recently more in the direction of having courts that we in Canada would understand to take a independent view of the issue at hand. But as I said, that's strictly with regard to particular aspects of the law. On human rights, I think the gist of our intervention today and our testimony is that we are very concerned that none of what has happened in Xinjiang recently with regard to mass detentions are in any way the result of a judicial process. I mean, it's been detention without an appearance in a court, an opportunity to appeal, any sort of appearance before a Chinese court.
Has there been other key states in the region that have voiced their concerns of the treatment of Uyghurs, and particularly maybe Turkey and various other states in the region?
Madam Chair, that's actually an excellent question. I think my statement referred to Canada working with like-minded. We also working with other partners who are concerned about the situation in Xinjiang. And we have been reaching out to countries like Turkey and others who are members of the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, given that the ethnic religious group in China that seems to have been most targeted by this are mostly professing the Muslim faith. So yes, the answer is we are looking to engage non-traditional partners, I think, to express their concerns. You may have noticed recently Malaysia, which previously had refooled Uyghurs who were seeking refugee status outside of China, had declined to send them back. I think the position of Turkey has been evolving. Turkey used to accept many Uyghurs who had claimed refugee status, particularly in Southeast Asia. And I think there's some evidence to suggest that their views on that particular issue have changed, maybe in the direction of being more willing to send Uyghurs back. But in terms of public statements, I think it's also fair to say that to date, there have not been very many expressions of concern, other than our traditional like-minded. So the European Union, as one of your colleagues referred to before, the United States, and some individual countries in Europe.
And are Uyghurs the only ones being sent to the re-educational centers, or is there an array of different minority groups as well?
Our understanding is it's primarily Uyghurs, though recently I think our information suggests that some of the Hui minority, which is also an Islamic minority in China, have also been subject to some of these measures, but that we're looking to confirm. It's just a suggestion at the moment.
Thank you.
Now we'll turn to Ms. Hardcastle for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to go back to a couple points that have already been made with regards to our knowledge of now recent knowledge of what's happening in the camps, organ harvesting, and our long history of cooperation, as you put it, with China. What can we be doing? What are the most effective ways right now that we can be working towards evidence gathering?
Well, I think there's various measures that we can take and avenues we can pursue. Obviously, working with like-minded partners. In terms of gathering evidence, while our ambassador has not yet been able to visit Xinjiang, our new ambassador, certainly members of the embassy in Beijing have been able to visit, though their visits are quite constrained both by security measures and I think it's fair to say by the concerns of individuals in Xinjiang that if they speak to foreign diplomats, they might suffer as a consequence. I think you'll have noticed that my opening remarks referred extensively to UN committee reports and UN authorities. And that's because they are really a credible source of information from a whole variety of sources, including confidential information that comes to them, whose confidentiality they must protect. So we're looking at all avenues for collecting information, and obviously the most important, frankly, is to get some data from Chinese authorities. I think it's been one of the things that has concerned us is that they, until very recently, wouldn't speak of the camps, whether for re-education purposes or anything else. That seems to have changed in recent weeks, but I think both on the part of the Government of Canada and like-minded and certainly UN authorities, it would be very helpful to have data on actually how many people have been sent to detention camps or re-education camps or whatever, however you wish to describe them. The numbers really vary, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, very much from thousands to 1 million, and in fact we've heard even far more than 1 million. So yes, data is very hard to get and is obviously a key concern for us. We don't want to make allegations that can't be founded, and so it would be very helpful to have the Chinese be a little more transparent about what is happening in Xinjiang. That would help, I think, all of us and help us to work with China to try and address what, at the moment, from the Canadian government perspective, we consider to be a very serious situation in which international human rights norms are being violated.
Are there some potential partnerships that you see that we could be working with, maybe other countries that are more apt to get this data? We do conduct business with China. We have relationships with China. Surely there are other entities we could be working with. Do you see some opportunities there? And if so, what do you? What can you talk to us about in ways that we can make proper recommendations?
Well, certainly some of the information that we have comes from people who have Canadians who've recently been in China, and that would include people that are doing business there. But I think the challenge, as I mentioned, in Xinjiang is that there are very few foreigners that are still in Xinjiang. So indeed, I think we will want to continue to work with UN agencies in particular to try and get some of the UN special representatives into Xinjiang to see the situation on the ground. We continue to work with like-minded and non-traditional partners to garner information. As I mentioned, we will have in November the Universal Periodic Review of China in Geneva, and that will be an opportunity for us not only to raise this issue, but for China subsequently to respond. And we expect that there will be other countries that will be raising our concerns. I think it's also fair to say, as you would have gathered from my opening statement, that we do rely to some extent on the reports of credible non-governmental organizations like Amnesty International, like Human Rights Watch, and those are only two that come to mind. So yes, we're seeking information from a number of sources, but of course, China is a responsible state and should be, as we have asked, more transparent about what is occurring there.
Are you aware of any Uyghurs that have been or are in a situation where they could be deported back to China
From Canada, you mean?
from Canada, or are you aware of a situation anywhere else in the world, then, let's just say, about this issue at large, since it is so recent, as you pointed out? You may not be aware of something specific here, but if you are, what do you know?
Well, I can't speak to individual cases in Canada.
Exactly.
I think that, as I mentioned in response to one of your colleagues, we're working very closely with IRCC and CBSA to make sure they're aware of the recent change in the situation in China. With regard to other countries, there have been a number of very high-profile, what they call refoulement, from countries where Uyghurs were seeking refugee status. From Thailand, for example, Malaysia, Turkey. So that situation, I think, dates from about 2015 to 2016, and various governments have taken various measures. I think in the case of Thailand, they had actually sent rather a large group back to China. Complicated in Thailand because Thailand isn't a signatory to the Convention on Refugees. So, but yes, there are a number of countries that have actually deported Uyghurs back to China, and something that I think is probably very problematic under current situation in the country.
Okay, and that is the time. So we'll move on to the second round, and to start that for 5 minutes, we have Mr. Fradris-Katos.
Thank you very much. Thank you especially for being here, and I apologize. At the outset, I missed your presentation. I was in another committee. We were reviewing legislation, so. But quite interested in your statement that I've read here, and in your comments subsequent. You mentioned, Ms. Buxley, the word credibility a moment ago, and I'd like to just go back to that if I could. There's competing claims that are being made. What standard are we using when it comes to assessing claims? How do we define credible claims? And I say that just out of interest because I certainly don't have an answer. That's a very difficult thing to do.
It's a difficult question to answer, I think. Obviously, we take very seriously the reports that we get from Canadian diplomats who've been able to visit. I think I've described the recent UN reports as credible, based on the number of people they would have interviewed and a wide variety of sources. I think we are always interested in assessing some of the information that comes to us, such as your colleague, I don't know if you were here, mentioned reports of a special organ harvesting station set up in Kashgar. I mean, that frankly was news to me, and we will definitely look into it. But as I say, the gold standard is usually the UN reports because of the wide variety of sources that they base their information on. Okay. And as I say, it's, I think, in all of our interests to make sure that the UN representatives have access to Xinjiang so that there will be reports that are seen to be credible and independently based.
Okay, and Canada has expressed concern, you write here, at meetings, for example, hosted by the U.S. State Department, meetings with a special focus on religious freedom. Mm-hmm. Can you delve into that a little more? We're working with, it would seem in this case, the United States, but other democracies to raise this concern. And certainly I know Prime Minister Trudeau put concerns forward just a few weeks ago.
Yes, I mean, I think the U.S. obviously is a key partner. And I think the U.S. doesn't have any better access to Xinjiang or to other independent reports than Canada, but clearly they're a key partner. And they have, as you know, paid particular attention to issues of religious freedom. But, I mean, frankly, we are working with a number of partners, both in Europe and in the region. And certainly we've been raising this issue with China for some months now with a view to getting information from China as to what is actually going on in Xinjiang, given the reports, not only in the press, but as I said, the credible UN report, that there really is a serious problem there in terms of mass detentions.
Thank you. Is there a sentiment that clearly exists among Uyghurs in terms of their political desires? Are Uyghur activists, can we say, are they pushing for political autonomy? Are they pushing for, would cultural protections minus political autonomy be fine? Is there a current of thought that wants, that is advocating for independence? It seems like a bit of a fractured sort of, well, I can't even say the word movement. It's a fractured set of priorities among Uyghur activists. Can you delve into that at all and offer any commentary on that?
I think at this point, I would say that Uyghur communities, like most, are very, very varied in their political views, in their religious adherence. I think, it spans the spectrum from some activists who would like to see an independent state to those who simply find it very difficult when elements of their religious and cultural traditions are not respected. So I think it's a very wide spectrum. That's, I think, the best way of answering your question. Sure. It's not a monolithic community either outside of China or inside Xinjiang.
No, certainly not. There's never any monoliths, so I think it's important to put those nuances on the table for our understanding. Is that time? Oh, that's time. Thank you very much.
And now we're on to Mr. Anderson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just in terms of the government's response to this issue, some of our neighboring congressmen that have called for sanctions on the appropriate Chinese officials. Has there been any word from the Canadian government on whether they think that's an appropriate response or not?
I think we would be looking at, a wide variety of options as the situation develops. At this point, I wouldn't want to indicate what any particular option we might recommend to the Minister of the Government. We have some of the same measures available to us as in the United States to our south, but I wouldn't want to be drawn at this point on what particular action we might take, sanctions or any other particular action. At the moment, I think our focus is very much on working multilaterally and bilaterally to raise these issues and hopefully to see the situation change.
So you just used the word "as the situation develops," but we've got massive local repression. We've got establishment of a DNA data bank, 1 million plus people in concentration camps, reports of organ harvesting, invasion of personal dwellings with videos, 24-hour video surveillance, officials placed in their homes during religious festivals. We've got kidnapping and demanded deportations, the disappearance of citizens and threats to their family, and complete travel restrictions on an entire community. I'm just wondering, does the government of Canada then see the sum total of this as some sort of anomaly, or do they see this as a systemic issue?
I think in my opening remarks I mentioned that we are very concerned by the extent of the mass detentions for whatever purpose, re-education or anything else in Xinjiang. I think the situation in Xinjiang, against the background of what has happened elsewhere in China, including in Tibet with regard to Falun Gong, etc., and Christian communities, is quite different. I mean, we've never seen credible reports of such vast numbers being detained.
Well, actually, in the past, they were executed by the same government, but that's another issue.
I think I would go back to what I said about the need to have not just reports, but to make sure that to the extent that we can, that those reports are verified and credible, and to some extent we do rely on UN agencies.
So are you suggesting the reports, there's some doubt as to the accuracy of the reports?
You listed a long number of reports, if I may, sir. Some of them, actually, I think we would agree are credible, and some of them bear additional scrutiny.
Can you tell me which ones would bear additional scrutiny then? Amount of local repression, the DNA data bank, do you know that exists?
I referred to that in my opening
Okay,
statement.
the people in concentration camps, do you know that exists?
We are well aware of the fact that thousands of people have been detained whether it's re-education camps or simply
Okay, so
detained or
that's-
thrown into prison.
So
But
thousands,
you're-
it's interesting, we've had
Sorry.
numbers between 1 million and 3 million, you say thousands. Reports of organ harvesting, do you find them valid?
I referred to that in my opening statement. I think
Are you
the
aware-
information
okay.
we have, if the information we have to hand, and I'm well aware of Mr. Kilgore's and other people's work on this before, the information we have to hand is that organ harvesting, particularly with regard to Xinjiang and with regard to Falun Gong, has decreased over the last few years.
Okay, are you aware of the invasion of personal dwellings, especially during Ramadan?
We're aware of activities like that which certainly impinge, and particularly during Ramadan, on the ability of residents and citizens of China to
Look,
practice
I
their
understand
faith.
you don't have authority in this area, but to talk about that sort of thing being an impingement on people's rights is I think, doing a disservice to what's happening there. You talked about the kidnapping and the deportations, the disappearance of citizens, I think. So these things are not, in my opinion anyway, left to doubt. They're happening at some extent. But I'm just wondering, how contrary to international norms does the Chinese government have to be in order to affect what you call the multifaceted priority relationship based on trust and mutual benefit? Like, at what point, how bad does a country have to be before we say we're just not interested in being involved with your market?
Perhaps I could go back to what I said at the beginning, and that was there has been an increase in information coming out in the last 6 to 8 months as to what is happening. Not all of that information can be verified. And I would cite the figure that you cited, between 1 and 3 million people have been detained. As I said, I think the 3 million, while it's being reported in the press, is not something that I'm in a position to confirm at this point. In terms of the Canadian government response, I think it's fair to say that we have raised this issue both in multilateral and in bilateral contexts in a way that certainly makes clear our view that this is an extremely serious situation. In terms of what we do next, when we have more information, as I said, that is something that we will, as I say, I'm not prepared to, I'm not in a position to say what measures we might be prepared to take in the future.
Okay, and that is your time, unfortunately. So we're going to Ms. Khalid.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ms. Puxley, for your testimony today and for answering questions of our colleagues. In 1949, the region where the Uyghurs are situated in Xinjiang was for a very short time annexed as East Turkestan. Became its own state, but it was very short-lived. Since that time, and then its rejoining of China, have these violations of minorities or just the ethnic populations in that region, has that continued from that time on to now, slowly escalating?
I wouldn't speak to the many decades since 1949. I think I'd have to get back to you on that. As I think I've made clear today, we are concerned about what seems to have been a deteriorating situation over the last 16 to 18 months, and particularly in the last few months. I think that's what our focus is at the moment. It's not, frankly, what might have happened in 1949, though that's obviously relevant, But our focus at the moment is trying to address a situation which we consider extremely serious in Xinjiang at the moment.
One of the concerns that we've heard is the lack or the inability of people to bring out firsthand recounts or testimony. And a number of people have indicated that they've deleted what is the popular app called WeChat in China, because it is heavily monitored in order to protect themselves. How do we, not just as a country like Canada, but United Nations and all international organizations, how do we get around in order to be able to get these firsthand testimonies? How are we collecting evidence of what's going on right now?
Well, as I think I might have mentioned, there's various sources. One is travel by Canadian diplomats and other diplomats to the region and sharing the information that we develop. One is from those people who've managed to get out and seek, refugee status in the region, whether it's Southeast Asia or in Turkey, or in some cases they managed to come to Canada. And as I mentioned, the UN does have sources of information from a wide variety of people that, on the basis that their information will be held in confidence. But I think you've pointed to a real difficulty, given the difficulty of both journalists and diplomats to access Xinjiang. And yes, we are certainly aware of the fact that some residents are so concerned about the extent of surveillance that, in fact, they're not using the apps that they would have had on their private cell phones out of concern that will put them and their families at risk.
Just one last question then. We had a witness come in our previous meeting, and he showed us a map of where China is developing the Silk and Belt Initiative. And he indicated that a lot of the regions where that infrastructure is going in are areas where human rights violations, ethnic cleansings are occurring, and the Xinjiang region is part of that infrastructure. Do you think that is a reason as to why this ethnic minority is being captured and put away?
Well, we've certainly heard a lot about Belt and Road, and my understanding is one of the northern parts of that project does go through some of the areas in Xinjiang. But I think our concern isn't so much related to the particular area where that northern route would go, as more generally the treatment of Uyghur minorities and other Muslim minorities in China. So I wouldn't tie our concern specifically to plans to build the Belt and Road. I think it's more an issue of lack of respect for international human rights norms more generally.
So we have time for a very short question from Ms. Hardcastle.
Madam Chair. Thank you, Ms. Pugsley. I just wanted to ask you very quickly if there are ways that Canada can or does help to protect the rights of activists here in Canada that are harassed by the Chinese government.
We are certainly aware of reports of Canadians of Uyghur background being harassed. We would encourage them to report such harassment to local police authorities, who are also aware of this more general issue. And to make sure that when we meet with them, that they speak about these issues to us. They're not, I think it's fair to say, the only community in Canada that is concerned in this regard. And it's an issue that has been raised with Chinese authorities in the past, and I expect will again be raised with Chinese authorities. But the first point of contact should obviously be with local police agencies for those who feel they are targeted in this way.
1 minute.
Okay, and can you tell me, are you aware of what happens to Uyghurs that are returned back to China?
Here again, I think there are credible reports that many lose contact with their families and relatives and families back home, and are also sent to these camps, whether they're re-education camps, detention camps, however one wishes to describe them. I think in my opening remarks I mentioned that we're aware of Canadians who have lost contact with family members who are Chinese citizens in China. And I think the concern is perhaps more general in that those who have gone back, for example, those who've been refooled from Thailand and Turkey have also, not been heard from again. So the simple answer is yes, we're aware of those reports. I'm not in a position to verify them, but they're obviously of concern.
Okay, thank you. And I'd like to thank Ms. Puxley for your testimony and thank all the members. We will now go in camera. We'll take a 1-minute break and go in camera for just 5 minutes to discuss committee business. Thank you very much. you.